You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
I want to introduce a tradition here for this podcast and all future podcasts, wherein I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present. Knowing the stories of the Aboriginal people will always be written in this landscape. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change. In this week's episode, I want to focus on a particularly significant and majorly impactful, in a negative way, issue that many people in our society are facing, despite the technology and the number of people who are now living on the planet. And that is the issue about loneliness. Now, it gets touched on from time to time, but I don't think we necessarily spend enough time talking about the difference between being alone, loneliness, and solitude. And this is one of the things that I want to cover in today's episode. Is I want to start looking at this issue more in depth because I want to encourage people to assess where they are at with this. Okay, so what is it that we talk about when we use that word loneliness? Now, fundamentally, loneliness is marked by feelings of isolation despite wanting social connections. It's often perceived as an involuntary separation, rejection, or abandonment by other people. Now, in this instance, I'm using and putting an emphasis on the word perceived. Okay, and you'll come to understand later why I'm using that word in this context. So, whether a person lives in isolation or not, feeling a lack of social connectedness can be painful. It's often described in different ways. Now, the University of California at LA has got a scale called the loneliness scale, and it asks individuals about a range of feelings or deficits of connection, including how often they feel a lack of companionship, how often they feel left out, whether they feel in tune with people around them, whether they feel outgoing and friendly, and whether they feel there are people that they can turn to. Now, again, like most of my podcasts, I want to put an emphasis on us as men because it is, for us as men, I think a much bigger problem than it is for most women, although they do experience that as well. Now, given the potential health consequences for those who feel like they have few or no supportive social connections, loneliness poses a major social issue. And I think it's important that we as a community, as a society, actually address this much better than what we are. Now, here's another point. There is a difference between loneliness, being alone, and a sense of solitude. The research very clearly, and my clinical experience really clearly defines that loneliness comes with some negatives for our mental and physical health. Whereas being alone is not the same thing as feeling lonely. In fact, as the title suggests, we can feel lonely in a crowd. But I can be happy alone. So, what about solitude? Well, solitude actually has a number of important mental health benefits, including the fact that we can recharge our battery, we can allow ourselves to focus better on issues that we might be needing to deal with. I find solitude really important in my life because I need to spend time in reflection and to some degree in meditation to maintain my sense of groundedness, my equilibrium. So, one of the other differences between loneliness and solitude is loneliness is pervasive. It's like an emptiness that we often experience internally. Solitude is fundamentally a choice. I can choose to take myself out of the hustle and bustle of the crowd and sit and reflect, and it's useful, it's enjoyable. Loneliness has none of those qualities. So let's, for a moment, focus a little bit on the issue about loneliness, health, and well-being. So the research is very clear about this. It is a problem and actually causes problems, okay? So what do I mean by that? Well, if I'm anxious and depressed, I'm probably more at risk of feeling lonely than if I'm not feeling anxious and depressed, right? So, this is one of the interesting sort of cycles. Whereas loneliness can actually make me feel anxious and or depressed, right? So, there's this interesting relationship between the two. So some of the research outcomes have shown that, loneliness is a definite risk factor for heart disease, type 2 diabetes, arthritis, and there's a whole bunch of other diseases. Now, interestingly enough, in each of those, one of the things that it tells me is that loneliness is actually a stress factor. I've worked with people with chronic illnesses for quite a long time in my career. And one of the things that with certain problems like type 2 diabetes, arthritis, if the person's overly stressed, those conditions get worse. They actually don't really feel that good. And so, again, we need to factor in the issue that loneliness is a stressor in someone's life. And again, it connects to a sense of anxiety and potentially depression. So, when I look at men's health, mental and physical health, one of the factors is that by the time most men are in their 60s, that they've had at least one or two episodes of either anxiety or depression. But also, many men have a pervasive sense of loneliness by the time they get into their 60s. And it fundamentally can become, in my view, a terminal disease. I think that disconnection, that social isolation, that inner isolation, in my view, is one of the significant triggers to suicide, or at least suicidality. Now, in 2017, Harvard conducted a study that followed a group of men for 8 decades. That's a really long time, 80 years. Right, now, fortunately, I'm not that old yet, so let me cut to the chase. These men were asked, who would you call in the middle of the night if you were sick or afraid? Now, what the study revealed was really, really interesting. Those who had close friends or someone that they could turn to were happier and physically healthier. Men are particularly fortunate if they have a childhood buddy who they continue to be connected with to this day. These are the men that have had the opportunity for the most intimate of relationships with other men. Now, we're not going to put the work into a new relationship that will get to a point of real intimacy. That comes with history, it comes with time. So part of that development is the capacity to be open and transparent and to really trust in new relationships that may not be at all present. And So, too often, we as men are essentially primed for loneliness. It's particularly the case that if we have our close relationships that are tied up with work. So, once we change jobs, we move on to another set of relationships. Again, they don't necessarily have the depth of a historically long term relationship. And this, I want people to think about this very clearly. We, these days have a habit of jumping very quickly from one scenario to another. There isn't that continuity. Even within families, there's often a considerable amount of disruption. So, these studies always come up with the same results, that they have a significant impact on our physical health and longevity. And I sometimes make a joke and go, men who are happily married tend to live 7 years longer than men who aren't. Well, it's not so much of a joke, it's actually quite factual. So, loneliness in men is linked to cardiovascular disease and strokes. And men account for about 80% of completed suicides. That is a staggering statistic. And it is, by definition, a sense of loneliness. Now, I'll come to explaining exactly more in detail how that works. So, in a way, the solution seems obvious. Have a healthy relationship, build a friendship network, and don't sedate your emotions with work, alcohol, drugs, sex, and gambling. Also, avoid getting addicted to exercise. The runner's high is not an antidote to emotional starvation, which is what loneliness in a way is. So you might then go, okay, well, what's the antidote? Well, I'm glad that you asked. And you're going to find that I'm going to come back to what I refer to often as the universal field theory of human wellness. And the issue is attachment. Healthy, secure attachment is the very thing that's going to get us inoculated against this sense of loneliness. But here's the thing. That process needs to come as much from the inside as it does from the outside. So yes, you're going to need to do some personal work. Stumbled over those words, but let's keep going. So what do I mean by internal personal work? Well, for a start, whenever we're talking about attachment, we're talking about, safe, secure attachment. And that usually has its foundations when we're kids. But let's say I didn't have, a family life where I could feel securely and safely attached to my parents. Well, as an adult, I can still work on that. I can still create a relationship with myself that allows me to feel safe and secure. And the other element in this is to develop a relationship with myself wherein I'm satisfied. That creates a level of flexibility and resilience that allows me to deal with negative life experiences, like the loss of friendships, the loss of a partner, the alienation that I might feel from being abandoned and rejected. So my inner world is about being strengthened and about being flexible, not rigid, about being adaptable, always self at the center of things. Now, part of that process is that I'm also therefore going to develop a greater degree of autonomy. Autonomy does not mean being alone and feeling lonely. It might mean being alone but still feeling safe, secure, and satisfied. The other part to this is having a sense of competence in how I deal with my emotional state. And the most important aspect in this is relatedness, connections. So, if it's going to be, it's up to me. So if I want connections in my life, I'm going to need to get off my butt and create them. They're not just going to drop into my lap. So I need to be attentive to my needs, but I'm also going to need to be proactive in establishing and responding to networks. Many people that I work with who have a sense of loneliness often fail to see that there are actually people around them who want to make contact with them, but because they're in this state of emotional emptiness in a way, they don't resonate to someone else's energy in a way that they can respond. And to me, that's sad. Now, in Australia, for example, we have the Are You OK Day. Now, that's a good trigger, that's a good sort of starting point, but we need to develop that into deeper conversations. So if the answer is, yeah, I'm good, then the next question is, are you really? Remind them that they're there, that you're there, that we can connect. It might be, at times a bit trivial, but at other times we develop relationships that become progressively more intimate. Now, as I said earlier on, a lot of those relationships have deep history. We go back to, maybe even kindergarten or just high school, and we've maintained those friendships all the way along. But we can also, by taking some social risks, accelerate the level of connection with new relationships. Now, that's a little bit of a sort of level 2 exercise because we don't want to be a bull at a gate either. But it gives us the opportunity to sort of go, okay, we mightn't have known each other very long, but we resonate with each other. We have common interests, or we've allowed ourselves to open up about an issue that normally we would keep under wraps. So this is going to be a work in progress. So what I want you all to do, and those of you who've been keen, and you might want to look up, the UCLA loneliness scale, just out of curiosity, or if you're really wanting to check in with how you are, see if you can find it on the internet. I haven't done that actually. To me, it's much, much more of a sort of subjective thing. Am I feeling lonely? Is there a particular time when that happens? So just that process of reflection, I want you to go back to that. I want you to check in with people who are important to you if they've had that experience of loneliness, or do they always feel, connected and, charged up for more social activity. Explore it. Please take it out of the living room and bring it into the space of friendships. Bring it into the space of families. I quite often hear from older men about how, they've got their kids and their grandkids, but they don't get to spend enough time with them, or they might get some time with it, but it's over very, very quickly. And then what happens between visits? It doesn't take a lot to connect with someone. Pick up the phone, call, drop by. Some people mightn't like that, particularly if they're, essentially highly private. But, what's the worst that can happen? They can go, I'm not available today. Come back another day, and we'll have some tea and scones, whatever. None of that's important. What's important is that we stay in contact. Firstly, with ourselves. What's my inner world like at this point? And then checking out what's available in the outside world. All right, this is me signing off until next week.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.